So welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you for being here today. My name is Matt Weil, and I am the director of the Elections Project here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So it's 2020. We've all made it. It's very exciting for my team. The Elections Project is very ready for 2020. And I did some calculations this morning. It is 293 days away from Election Day. That means that Iowa is having its caucus in 19 days. New Hampshire is having their primary in 27 days. And Super Tuesday, when 15 states are having their primaries, is only 48 days away. So what does that mean for election administrators? It means that the election isn't actually 293 days away, it's here. Because for those voters who are covered by the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, UOCAVA, those ballots have to be in the mail 45 days before an election. So starting on Monday, there are going to be a lot of ballots out there going to our American citizens overseas. Election years are very fun for me. A lot of people who I don't get to talk to a lot during the year are very interested in the work that I do. It's also the time when everyone becomes an expert in elections and they have opinions about how to improve the process. It's not really that unlike how I become during the Olympics when I have comments and thoughts about every single sport that I know nothing about. Just a note, if you are in the wrong event and you're actually more interested in the Olympics, that starts in 191 days. So again, thank you for coming to today's event. I really appreciate everyone being here. This is the culmination of a year's worth of work for my team, bringing together 21 state and local election officials to agree upon logical election policy. What makes our group unique is that it was made up of only state and local election officials, the ones who have to implement policy. There are a lot of good ideas out there, but policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. The greatest policy implemented poorly isn't going to serve America's voters that well. It's not going to improve the voting experience. American voters really expect that the voting process is going to be secure, accessible, and accurate. And individuals should have convenient ways of casting their ballots, but only those who are eligible should be able to do so. Our elections are really complex. They involve many federal and state election laws, and they're administered by over 8,000 local election administrators who have to be everything from logistical experts to cybersecurity experts and everything in between. That's why the Bipartisan Policy Center created this task force. Our goal is simple. It's just to create a roadmap for policymakers to understand their options when they're doing election reform, but also to highlight the upstream and downstream effects of making changes to policy in one area. I'm going to leave the specific conversation about recommendations to Charles Stewart, who's moderating our second panel, and the great task force members who are able to join us today, and I appreciate that. But while I'm up here, I did want to take a few minutes to thank the people who made this possible. Certainly all 21 of our task force members, we appreciate all the time they gave to this effort. They attended events in person throughout the country 3 times last year. I don't know how many times we were on conference calls, a lot. I don't know how many times you had calls with me and my staff individually, and they all certainly provided their line edits to the report. So I appreciate all of that. I also want to point to our team here at BPC, John Fortier, is over there, Michael Thorning, Tim Harper, Rachel Ori, Chris Thomas have all made this absolutely possible. I also do want to note, and I don't know if she's in the room, Brenna has been our program associate on our team for 3.5 years now, and really making sure that everything that we want to do can happen. Today is Brenna's last day, which is sad for us, but it was actually slightly terrifying for me in December when she told me she had an exciting new opportunity, because I thought she was leaving then, and was going to leave before the report actually got to the design phase and before this event happened. Thankfully, she made her last day our event, so I appreciate that, and thank you for everything you've done, Brenna. I also want to just note that our content, while we've spent a lot of time on that, we think we're very proud of it. It would not look this good and polished without BPC's digital team, communications team, and events team, so I appreciate their work. At this time, I want to invite Congressman Rodney Davis to give a few remarks. Congressman Davis was going to be on our panel, but unfortunately there are votes scheduled and he has to do his job. And so I will turn over to Congressman Davis.
Thank you. Thank you. Hold your applause, please. Hey, thank you. And Matt, I really appreciate it. I actually was looking forward to the back and forth like we had last year. I wanted to hear some questions and be able to respond. I had the opportunity to address this group during about a year ago now. And it was a great back and forth, talking about what our views were, what we look forward to addressing when it comes to election reform and election security during this Congress. Really disappointed I don't get a chance to sit with Secretary Raffensperger and Commissioner Hovland on the panel and either sit and cheerlead what you guys are doing, or of course, like we do here in Congress, complain if we disagree with you. But I really appreciate the Bipartisan Policy Center for really having me back. Election policy matters. It doesn't make the front page. It's not in the 24-hour news cycle. But since becoming the ranking member of the House Administration Committee, which, as many of you know, it oversees federal elections, we've held 3 markups of election policies, and we've had 5 election-related hearings, including a hearing just last week where we had voting machine CEOs come in and testify in our committee of 9. House Administration, I think it's very important. But we have 9 members on that committee, and it's become a committee that's become more of a legislative committee this Congress, more so than it ever has in its entire existence. I introduced 2 election security bills over this Congress, H.R. 3412, the Election Security Assistance Act, and H.R. 4736, the Honest Elections Act. And both of those bills take aims at addressing some of the types of interference that we saw in 2016, and also focusing on assisting states like Georgia and others, my home state of Illinois, bolster their election security measures too. We think they're good bills. We think they ought to be able to get a fair hearing. Some positive things that we've already done, the recently passed National Defense Reauthorization Act, the NDAA, we've included many election security provisions that were asked for by folks like our secretaries of state, by folks that are in charge at the EAC, like the commissioner, in implementing changes to ensure that our election system is more secure. We will make sure that we have better interoperability to provide state, local, and national officials with instances of possible intrusion. Communication matters. One of the big things that we can do here in Washington is to make sure that all 3 levels of government talk to each other and make sure it's not just about money, but make sure that money goes to areas that we're really going to see real results. And there's not many areas in government that have seen such bipartisan cooperation at all levels to address a problem that existed in 2016. And that's great. We want to continue to allow that to happen. Those are our priorities. Those are Chair Lofgren's priorities, and those should be America's priorities, in my opinion. We also, both Republicans and Democrats, work to give $425 million in HAVA grants to states in order to help them secure their elections. Spend it wisely. Okay? So we see cooperation in a city that is not known right now when you turn on the TV for any type of cooperation whatsoever. Things are happening in this arena that should be touted. And that's what I think a group like yours, the Bipartisan Policy Center, you recommended that states enact meaningful election reform. We're helping them to do that, we believe. And that's a direct result, I think, of efforts by groups like yours to make sure that this was an issue with increased scrutiny. And we also want to make sure that we highlight what we've done that has worked. Remember, we had historic turnout in the midterm elections in 2018. Anybody hear of any instances of foreign intrusion? I see none. I'm going to take that as a no, but that should be celebrated. We should be talking a little bit more about what we're doing right in this field instead of always going back to instances of 2016 where we know we had a problem, but we worked together to help correct those problems. The secretaries of state can tell you that. Our local election officials can tell you that. The EAC has now been entrusted to ensure that those efforts continue to move forward. Those are the things that we should be talking about in Washington, but instead we're talking about other issues that are much more partisan. Last year, our committee marked up 3 bills. Remember, I said we have 9 members of Congress on the House Administration Committee. I'm the lead Republican on the smallest committee in Congress. I have 3 Republicans on that committee in the minority. We had 3 major election bills marked up through that committee. One, a 600-plus page behemoth, H.R. 1. While there were some good things in all of these bills, there were also some major areas that I disagreed with. So those are areas that I think we can, as we move together, we've got to figure out which areas of those major pieces of legislation the Democrats tried to ram through our small committee and had a partisan vote on each of them on the floor of the House. We ought to be able to come together and get things done in the areas we agree with. And that's why I'm glad to be here and working with folks like the Secretary and the Commissioner too. We want secure elections, very much so. That's our goal. We're getting secure elections. Look at 2018. Look at the investments that we've made. These things matter. And that's why we're going to continue as we move forward. We have some ideas where I think we can work together. And we need the help of the BPC to make that happen. And also of the SOS, the Secretaries of State, too. Make sure you tell Secretary LaRose I said that, too. We got to reform HAVA. It's been since 2002 since that bill was implemented. We have so many more issues, not just in the election security arena, but the election technology arena, that we've got to be able in a bipartisan way to update HAVA so that the EAC commissioners can do their job of getting the funds that we're investing out to our secretaries of state, our state boards of elections, as in the case of Illinois, and our local election officials. So let's work together. We need your help helping us lead a reform of HAVA. We also need to look at securing more modern voting and election administration methods. Centralized voter registration databases. Look, the programs and the security protocols that we make our election voting machine vendors follow through the VVSG standards administered through the EAC, they don't apply to voter registration databases. As we all know, as we move into the future, we're going to have more e-poll books. We're going to have more electronic technology at the voter registration portion. Maybe we start to look at putting together some guidelines that our voter registration databases are going to have to follow. Think about it. Where was the intrusion in 2016 in my home state of Illinois? Was it at Christian County, Illinois' electronic voting machine with a paper backup that I use each time? Did somebody hack into that? Did the Russians do that? No, but the Russians did try to hack into our State Board of Elections voter file, our statewide voter database for voter registration. That tells me we've got to do something better, because if that's an area that doesn't have as much scrutiny, maybe that's where government can come in as Republicans and Democrats and get things done. We're doing things right in Illinois, too. Just last week, being on the committee, even though it's a small committee, I get a chance to choose some witnesses every once in a while with hearings. And I had the chance to pick a witness to come and testify at the election vendor hearing, and I chose my home county clerk, my local election official. He's a Democrat. I'm a Republican. Republicans don't choose Democrats to sit in their witnesses, right? I mean, if you turn on TV, you would never think that would happen. But I did, because you know why? I know Mike Genesi because I grew up with him. I went to school with him. I graduated high school with him. And I know there is nobody in my home county that wants to run a fairer and faster election process than Mike Genesi. I don't care if he's a Democrat. He's my friend. He's doing a good job. Our local election officials aren't partisan. Our local election officials shouldn't be partisan. Our local election officials should care, like Mike does, about getting elections that are fair, getting elections that make sure people don't have to wait in lines, and making sure the technology works. So bipartisan support at the local, state, and federal levels is essential for Mike to be able to do his job. But Illinois has a Cyber Navigator program. They're making sure that we have policies in place that our local officials know that if they think that there's an intrusion on their voter registration system or by chance maybe an election machine, they know who to call. Simple things like this in Washington can be done to make sure that our local election officials are able to do their job. I think a national initiative mirroring Illinois' campaign could be something that we could have bipartisan support on, so we stop cyber threats before they get to our precincts. And look, at the end of the day, our federal government and our role in the federal government is to ensure that the states have every resource possible to run their elections. And that's an area that I think we're going to continue over the next Congress, in the next few years, the rest of this Congress, to continue to push forward. I'm glad election security is getting more scrutiny because it gives us a chance to make things better. And I look forward to working with each and every one of you. Sorry I can't answer your questions. That dastardly thing called doing my job and going to vote, I got to do. So thanks, everyone, and good luck.
One over. All right. So our first panel is entitled Defending Elections at the State and Local Level, or State and Federal Level. But it's much broader than that, certainly. What I really want to have a conversation about today, it's still on that topic, don't worry, is broader. It's more, how can the federal government help states run their elections? What do the states need? What do the localities need? Where there's some comparative advantages? Where are we not being the most efficient? So let me introduce my panel. We've all met Congressman Rodney Davis, who is here. Commissioner Ben Hovland. So Commissioner Hovland was nominated by President Trump and confirmed by unanimous consent to the EAC in 2019, very early in 2019. Commissioner Hovland is currently the vice chair, but soon to be the chair of the commission in February, likely. We have to vote on it, but yes, likely. And he serves as the designated federal officer for the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, TGDC, which helps to create the VVSG, the Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines. Ben has been in and around elections for 20 years, most recently serving as the acting chief counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, where he was the driving force, or a driving force, behind getting the $380 million to the states in 2018. A driving force, sorry. Earlier in his career, he served as Deputy General Counsel for the Missouri Secretary of State's office, where he focused on election administration, recounts, poll worker training, voter registration list maintenance, statewide database matching, voter education resources, and ballot initiative litigation. And Ben has also served as an attorney for the Fair Elections Legal Network. So welcome, Ben.
Thank you.
Next to him is Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. Secretary Raffensperger is the CEO and owner of Tendon Systems. Tendon is a specialty contracting engineering design firm with nearly 200 employees, which operates in 35 states. He has served 2 terms in the Georgia General Assembly from 2015 to 2019, and you were elected Secretary of State in 2018. So welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
So I guess the first question is going to be quite broad, and I'd like to get your initial thoughts, and we can certainly start narrowing it down. What is the appropriate federal role for what is the appropriate role for the federal government in elections?
I assume you're asking me.
I'm going to ask you first.
You know, I think one of the real challenges in elections, and particularly for people who haven't really worked in the space, is figuring out that balance. You know, as you mentioned in my biography, you know, I feel privileged to have worked at the various levels. I still haven't done local, which I should, but I worked at the Missouri Secretary of State's office, so I've had that viewpoint. I worked at the Senate to have the legislative perspective, and now in an administrative capacity at the EAC. I think what I've seen over that time is finding that balance where you know, I think you traditionally see in federal legislation, it tends to be floors, but it really leaves the states to be the laboratories of literal democracy here. And you see great innovation in the states. And so I think where we can ensure that, you know, people have the right to vote, that they're able to vote, but leave the flexibility for the states to innovate is really a great balance that we've seen work in a lot of places.
Secretary Raffensperger, the same question.
Well, I think that the federal government brings some resources that we don't have at the state level and the capacity. One of those would be obviously cyber, you know, from foreign actors in particular, because they just have you know, larger resources. So that's really important for us. And then I think also to have a standard for testing of new voting equipment, so we have a common standard, because that really gives voters a you know, sense of calm or peace that it's been tested. There's you know, some standard that the systems have. And so I think those are 2 areas that are really at the federal level you can really, you know, help assist the states. But really at the end of the day, you know, elections bubble up at the precinct level, to the county level, to the state level. And I think that's the appropriate form that we've had for 200 and some odd years. And I think we need to continue on.
So you mentioned voting systems, so I'll talk about that. Commissioner Hovland, you serve as the liaison to the TGDC. I think there are a lot of concerns about voting systems in the public, usability, security. And we know that in many states, they're going to be using new voting systems this time compared to 2018 or 2016. How do you assess where we are today, where we still need to go, and how we're going to get there?
So, this is, how long do we have? 'Cause
Yeah.
there's a lot to unpack there, but I mean, I do think, as the Secretary said, you know, some of the work at the EAC on the voluntary voting system guidelines, I really do think there is a natural benefit and economies of scale to having a federal program. Why should there be 50 different voting certification programs? That doesn't make sense for the states. That would be costly for them. That doesn't make sense for vendors. But we have to have a program that works. And as you know, we've had a history that has been bumpy, but I think we are on the way up, and I think we are working on the VVSG 2.0, and hopefully that will be done soon. But I think what that is really about is ensuring that the next generation of election equipment is better, and that we build a program around that really is focused on customer service and good governance and being a resource and a value add to the space. And I think doing that ensures that election systems continue to improve going forward.
Secretary Raffensperger, Georgia is one of those states that has a new voting system. So how did you guys settle on what you did, and what are you looking for in 2020?
Well, we are actually going through our second statewide implementation. The first one we ever did was in 2002, and that's when we made the decision in the General Assembly, long before my time, that we'd have a uniform system throughout the state. Obviously, that was a DRE system. It is aged out, so we're now implementing a new system with touchscreen technology, a ballot marking device with a verifiable paper ballot trail. And so we're going to have that implemented, 33,100 machines throughout the entire state. We have 159 counties. Even though we're not the second largest in population, we're the second number in counties, 159 counties for the March 24th presidential preference primary. And so we're really moving fast. So it's a big lift. It's the largest and fastest implementation that's ever occurred in this country.
That's great. One of the things that Congressman Davis mentioned was the $425 million that was appropriated at the end of last year for the states. I mentioned the $380 million that you were one of the driving forces behind in 2018. By my calculation, that's $805 million that the federal government is now providing to states. From what when I've talked to state and local election officials, I think they're looking for clarity on how to spend it well, how to spend it quickly so that it can be impactful for 2020. So what does success look like when it comes to how to spend this federal money well, be good stewards of the taxpayers' money, and to secure the elections going forward?
Absolutely. So with a little bit of my former hat on, I can talk more about the 2018 money, but again, the 2020 money looks a lot like that. The reason that Congress provided so much flexibility is because each state does look so different, and each jurisdiction does look so different. And so when you're looking at increasing security, those needs really vary. Some states we've seen replace aging and paperless equipment. Other states we've seen either replace their statewide voter registration database or harden that with things like multi-factor authentication. Congressman Davis mentioned the Cyber Navigator programs. I think these are one of the best things out there to really help provide the technical expertise that a lot of jurisdictions, frankly, don't have the resources or capacity to have. And so I think that has been a great model. I think with the $425 million, I think for certain states like in Illinois, who, backing up, the 2018 money was 5-year money. So some states have budgeted out 5 years of program, which is logical. We're going to get the 2020 money out the door very quickly. But for states who had budgeted out that 5 years, knowing that more money is coming, they can also start spending some of that they already had immediately. And I think, the reality is where we are in the cycle, there's only certain things that you're able to do, but so much of this is really about, I think of elections as an infrastructure. It is now critical infrastructure, but it's building in the process and the strength in the long term. So it can't just be about 2020 election. It has to be about 2022 and 2024 and building systems that are strong enough moving forward.
One of the things that was different about the 2020 appropriation and the 2018 appropriation was a significant rise in the state match. So the states are going to have to put up some more money to access the federal funds. How does that impact how quickly you guys can get it out the door? Does the legislature need to get involved? And what do you plan on doing with that money once you have it?
We probably have two key thrusts. Number one, we've said to everyone that security is our number one goal. It's our highest priority because we understand how important the cyber and the back office, the voter database, how important that is. So we're going to be looking at whatever we can do to strengthen that. But then also voter education. We have a new system coming out. So we'll be doing a lot of social media videos. In fact, Georgia Public Television has already done a little video, put it on their website. So we're going to be looking at how do we help voters and how do we get them prepared. That's a new system. It's similar but different, and that's our mantra that we're out there with. So we want people to have a great experience. The whole idea, when you show up to vote, we don't like lines. Voters don't like lines, and we understand that. So we want to be able to help voters navigate through there so that they understand what the process is, that they actually have after they made all those selections, press the button, they still haven't voted until they drop that paper ballot into the scanner, the ballot scanner. So that's real important, just so we can have an efficient election, so people have fun with it. It should be a great day. It shouldn't be misery, it should be fun.
One of the other complaints that we've heard about the federal funding is that it's just not getting down to the frontline election administrators. What can states consider doing to make sure that more of the local administrators are getting access to the funds that they could use to improve the voting experience for their voters?
We've definitely heard that from a number of jurisdictions and states. It really varies across the country. And I think, again, some of that depends on what the needs were. Again, if you needed a new statewide voter registration database or you needed to harden that system, and number one, we saw that was where a lot of focus of 2016 activity was, but that's also something that benefits the entire state. And so we did see some states that passed most of the money down. We've seen states that kept most of it up top. And I think with the additional 2020 money, it'll be interesting to see what that does, in the sense of, if you had an initial investment in a new statewide voter registration database, now maybe you're in a position to award more local grants, and we're certainly hopeful to see that.
What's happening in one state certainly impacts what's happening in every other state. I mean, I think you go back 20, 30 years, maybe states could really run their own elections separately. But since Florida, I'm sorry, Brian, certainly, the mantra's been, we don't want to be the next Florida, which is not fair to Florida. That said, I do think that there are confidence issues. Voters, hear stories, but what they're hearing is different from what's happening in their states. You have very long deadlines for certification of results in places like California, very short ones when you come back out east. And so it's just leading to a lot of misinformation, miscommunication among voters. What can the federal and state officials, particularly the secretaries of state, really, do to make sure that their voters are getting clean, accurate information quickly during a fast-paced, moving media environment around elections?
Well, I think for us, a lot of it's just we're upgrading our equipment. We're expecting to get election results on election night a lot faster, just because of better technology. Right now we were using equipment that was 18 years old, so we're excited that we're going to be upgrading to something that is a lot more modern, and it'll be a lot faster. So we're going to get faster results, and that's good. We're also going to be establishing to do risk limiting audits as part of the process. So people, at the end of the day, like I'd like to say, I understand that things are contentious at times, but we want people to have that confidence that the election results are accurate. You may not be happy with the results because your person didn't win, but if you have that confidence that the results were accurate, that's what we're called to do as election officials.
I think some of the other things that are happening, the secretaries are involved in a collective effort, Trusted Info 2020. I think that's a great effort to help drive voters toward the trusted source of information, which is state and local election officials. We at the Election Assistance Commission have recently partnered with GSA on vote.gov. We're looking to enhance that, and again have government sources, state, local, federal sources where people can go to get trusted information. I think that's a big piece of it. And then I think simply for voters, engaging early, checking their voter registration, making sure their voter registration is current and updated. And then certainly I hate to miss an opportunity to give a plug for being a poll worker or an election judge. I think it's a great experience, and for anyone that maybe wants a little bit more confidence in the process, I think actually being a part of it, you see all the checks and double checks that go into it. You see all the pieces that really go into making Election Day great. And I think that, I know for me, it's been one of the more valuable experiences I've ever had. It is a long day. It isn't easy.
It is a long day. I've done it many times.
But it is worthwhile. And
So I will warn everybody, we have about 5 minutes before I'm going to turn to your questions. Otherwise, you have to listen to me ask more questions. But in those 5 minutes where you're thinking about your questions, and they should be questions, I want to ask two questions to you. You can both answer them. You're coming to this from very different perspectives. You're an elected official. You've been here for 20 years as a lawyer. What are the stories, what are the positive stories that aren't being told, the voters don't understand? And the flip side of that, going to 2020, what's keeping you up at night?
Well, I guess coming from Georgia, I guess the story is that many people don't realize we have a great story to tell, that we were one of the first states to do online voter registration. Many people don't realize that, and we got it right when we did it. And then we also have what's called opt-out. So when you go get your driver's license, that you will be registered to vote. And so we have huge numbers. We think that this year we'll have 7 million people registered to vote in our state, and we're expecting a huge turnout. We expect 5 million voters this year. So we've got a great story to tell. We have new voting systems that are being implemented. And at the end of the day, we also have, at our county level, what I call personal integrity. The county election officials want to get the job right. And they might come from this side or that side, down the middle, but they just want to do their job. They don't want to be in the evening news, and they're working hard to make sure that we have clean, fair, and accurate elections. And that's all we can ask from our election officials.
One of the real privileges I have in this job is I get to travel around the country and see how folks are administering elections, the work that they're doing, the work they've been putting in, and it is truly awesome. You know, I probably should just take a video camera around and then I could produce a documentary that no one would watch, but would undoubtedly give anyone that watched it a lot of confidence. I mean, it really is amazing to see the work that state and local election officials have been putting in, and it should give voters confidence. As far as what keeps me up at night, I have a 2-year-old that doesn't sleep as much as I'd like him to, but when I'm awake with him, I think about, you know, what his democracy will look like in the future. And the thing that worries me is that people do lose confidence in it. And again, you know, for the most part, you know, the average American just wants to show up and vote for the candidate of their choice and believe that it will be counted as they intended it to be. And I am fully confident that that will happen. You know, I know that I've been at conferences with cybersecurity experts, and you know, they have talked about the various vulnerabilities in our system, because all computers have vulnerabilities, but there's so much of that that has been mitigated. There are so many of those threats that are addressed by the hard work that election officials do. And when you ask those folks, do you vote? They say yes, because they have confidence in the process. And so I think that's important for Americans to know. And again, as I said, if they want a little more, they should consider being a poll worker.
Sounds right. Secretary Raffensperger, anything keeping you up at night, or you don't want to?
Well, cybersecurity, the back office, you know, because we know hackers don't sleep, and so, but we do need our 8 hours. So those 8 hours we're sleeping, we wonder what they're doing in their parents' basement or wherever they are, and so that's those threat vectors. We don't know where they're going to come from, and that's what keeps us up.
Right. All right. Well, there are some microphones in the auditorium, so if you have some questions, please find one of those. Oh, there's one back there.
Hi, thanks. Cameron Joseph of Vice News. This question's for Secretary of State. When are you guys going to announce the conclusion of your investigation into whether your statewide data election system was hacked in 2016? I know that you guys have been working on that for a while.
Well, it wasn't hacked. You know, I know that there's attempts on that, but it wasn't hacked. There's never been, from what our understanding is, anywhere that any databases. I know there were attempted penetrations in Florida and Illinois, but our system was not hacked.
But there's an ongoing internal investigation into what was.
Well, some of that is
right?
actually litigation, and so on the litigation part, we really can't comment on.
Okay, and obviously with the new system, you know, there's some concerns, complications. I know there's a lot of litigation flying around in your state. When are you guys going to issue the rules of the road for auditing 2020 in case there are any issues?
Well, the way the House Bill 316 was written in the General Assembly, that this year the audit process is really pilot audits. And so we already began risk limiting audits for the municipal elections we had in the fall. We did 6 county elections, and so that's the process we started with. We had several officials that went up to Virginia and watched and observed their process, and we've implemented many of those measures. But we'll be rolling that out. We've already had a task force, a roundtable on audits and what that process will be. But we'll have that defined, and then we'll be codifying that in the state election board meetings, I believe, next year. This year, our big lift will be having statewide implementation of the new system and doing audits wherever we can. We're not required by law to do that, but we want to implement that as soon as possible. But if you look at Colorado, they began their process, I believe, in 2010, and then they kept on adding additional counties. And so we have 159 counties, so it will take us, we'll do it fast in Colorado because we can learn from states that are a little bit ahead of us on this, but that's our goal, obviously.
And
I just wanna make sure I'm
certainly
understanding
the auditing is something that we endorse. We endorse a culture of auditing in our report, which we're going to talk about in the second panel. But I do want to make sure we have time for other questions as well. See you in the back.
Hi, Tom Hicks with the EAC. Secretary, Chairman or Vice Chair Hovland talked a little bit about poll workers and people becoming involved. Can you talk a little bit more about your ambassador program of getting young people to serve as poll workers and election workers overall?
Yeah, we have a program in Georgia. It's the Student Ambassadorship Program. And my hometown of Johns Creek's won that now 2 years in a row. I had nothing to do with that, but really it's to encourage high school students being engaged in the process. You can become a poll worker in Georgia if you're 16 or older, and so we actually give them points as they volunteer. So we want students to become involved with that. Plus, with the new systems, we have an iPad as part of the electronic poll book when they show up. There's some technology. We think it's really neat, and we think that students will really appreciate that. It's not your grandfather's way of voting. It's a new system, and so we added that to encourage young people to become poll workers. We've had in the past 2 programs down near the Savannah area and also up in Forsyth County to encourage young people to come out and become poll workers. We'd love to encourage more students to become poll workers. It's a new system, and we're expecting a big turnout, so we are going to need more poll workers than we have had in the past. Thanks for your question.
Over here, right in front.
Kay Oshel, retired federal employee. You had referenced 18-year-old election systems as being very outdated. What is the average life expectancy when you purchase an election system?
Life expectancy or what it should be or how it is used, in the sense of, I think one of the historic issues, obviously a lot of what we've talked about today has been the $380 million from FY18 and the $425 million. But, part of the reason that money has been so important is the underfunding of elections. We had the Help America Vote Act, and it was essentially $3 billion, and you had a nationwide replacement of equipment. And, that was sort of the first time that you had that broad scale equipment change across the country. We've seen a lot of that equipment start to age out or be replaced, and so you have that vantage point. But one of the things that is really challenging is you have jurisdictions that have had to patch that equipment together or find spare parts where they can, because they don't have the funding to replace it in the most timely manner. And so I think a big piece of that, frankly, or addressing it is, you hear people talk about that we need a whole of government approach for cybersecurity and election cybersecurity, and I think that's true. But I also think it's important to talk about a whole of government approach in funding elections. State and local election officials, absolutely run elections and absolutely should be responsible for paying for it. But there's a federal portion of the ballot, and there is a federal role, as we were discussing earlier. And so I think, figuring out how to best fund elections will change the timeline for what is realistic to expect out of your election equipment going forward.
Your question with our new system, the one advantage that we have with this system versus the old one is that we're going to start at the front end with the electronic poll book. It's an iPad. So as Apple will update the software, we'll get those software upgrades so that the iPad will not become obsolete. But if the iPad actually goes, falls apart, you break it, whatever, we can replace it. And so it's almost like plug and play by piece. Then when you come to the ballot marking device, that's on Windows 10. If we end up with 11, 12, 13 software upgrades, we'll be able to incorporate that so you don't end up with a dated software code like we did with the DREs. Likewise with the printer, our printer that we're using right now is a Hewlett-Packard printer. It's not real big. It looks like something you could buy at a local office store. And so we'll be able to upgrade, the printers, the ballot scanner, the same idea. So it's really not the whole system that you have to replace, but parts, if they do wear out, we'll be able to upgrade that. And the software, as we move through the system, we'll be able to upgrade that. And then obviously the voter database on the backside, we want to make sure that we continue to strengthen that for cyber threats and make sure that stays current. And we can be able to update that going forward also. So we won't end up, I don't believe, in that same situation. And then we'll have to see what we end up in 2025, 2030. Someone will have some great new idea on how to vote, and we'll just look at how we incorporate that in.
Right here. Sorry. Front.
Hi, Don Wolfensberger with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Mention was made of a program that voters can access to get accurate information about elections, and I assume about candidates, but what role, if any, can state election officials and the federal government play in countering misinformation that's put out over social media, especially about candidates?
I would say, to be, I guess, responsible to my jurisdictional issues, candidates are a bit outside of my purview. But, again, I think we do see, I think the way that you see some of these foreign adversaries acting is mimicking certain traditional divides or ways that voter suppression efforts have been happening. And so you see efforts to potentially talk about, certain people vote on Wednesday or a day that isn't appropriate. And so I think educating voters to know, again, where that trusted source of information is, know who their state election official is, know who their local election official is, and know how to get that information is a big piece of at least ensuring that their ability to participate in the process is there, and that they know, when their registration deadline is, they know when, if they have an early vote period, what their options are in their state, et cetera. And so, again, I think NASA's efforts with Trusted Info 2020 are great, and I think we need to see more of that. I think our decentralized system is great in a lot of ways, but one of those areas that I think we can improve is in communication and ensuring that more people know the right place to get the information about how to participate.
Time for one last question.
Well, I was just going to answer from the standpoint when one candidate is throwing mud at the other candidate. That's not the office of Secretary of State. Our job is just to administer the election process. That's the job of the political consultants on both sides, and they can do what they're going to do, and they do it already. I've been in several runoffs, several races. I get that. But I never called and asked for help from the Office of Secretary of State, and that's not our role. Our role is to make sure that we have clean, fair, accurate elections, and the candidate's job is to do whatever they do to try and get elected, I guess. It'd be nice if we could raise and elevate the level of civil discourse in this country, but such are the times that we are in right now.
Final question here.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the Foreign Service. I'd like to ask, to what degree are you concerned about polling stations as far as the number and the location in the state or in the county, in the jurisdiction, so that all members who are eligible to vote have adequate opportunity to vote?
In the state of Georgia, we've already put out to our election officials, please expect 5 million people to come out and vote this fall and plan accordingly. Expect big numbers, but you also have to really just run some quick numbers. I'm an engineer, so I start running numbers. And it's like, if you have this many people in a precinct and you look at how many people can move through the line and what you're expecting, then you better make sure you have enough machines to really handle that. And then you may need to redeploy people in your county. We increased in our purchase by 10%. So every county will have enough machines. Now it's the county election officials' job to make sure that they're deployed in the right levels. You don't need to have 20 machines in this county if you have 100 voters. But likewise, and so you need to really plan for so we have uniform line flow. It's something, I guess I'm good at that because I'm an engineer, and we're trying to help the county election officials administer their elections best they can. Thanks for the question.
It's also a great way for us to highlight BPC's work in polling place lines. We put out our report on the 2018 election just late last year, so we have some work on that as well. Well, thank you guys for being on the panel. I'm going to call up the second panel.
All right, well, this is an exciting day, and there is the tyranny of the timer, so we'll try to jump into it. I'm Charles Stewart. I'm professor of political science at MIT and the director of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. This panel, with three experts who I'll be introducing just a second, is going to be focusing on the report that's been released today by the BPC that Matt was mentioning a bit ago, and highlight some of the proposals in that report. I'll introduce the panel in just a second. I think just a few things to introduce the panel. The first thing about the report is that it does help to illustrate how, while there's been great strides in improving election administration since the President's Commission on Election Administration early in this decade and before, there's always room for improvement. And one of the things that I've noticed in my 20 years of professionally studying elections is that increasingly there's a sense of continual improvement in elections. And I think that's a reflection of the report. The report also demonstrates the wealth of information and insight that America's election administrators have to offer in providing suggestions about how to make things better. It's reflected in the report, and the people on the stage embody that personally, and we'll be hearing from them in just a second. Another point I'll make is that when you look at the report, there's 21 recommendations, and we don't have time to talk about all those recommendations. Those recommendations are about registration, casting ballots, and counting the vote. And so the panelists will highlight a few of the recommendations, but there are certainly other things in the report that they can talk about. And so with that in mind, let me just say a word about who's up on the stage, and then we'll get going. Immediately to my left is Mandy Grangine, who's the Ohio Director of Elections and Assistant Secretary of State. Then to her left is Judd Choate, Director of Elections for the Colorado Secretary of State. By the way, we figured out, should we let loose about the order of the panel? Or not? Let's not. Brian Corley, next to Judd, is the Supervisor of Elections for Pasco County, Florida, and then Chris Thomas, the youngest member of the panel, is currently a fellow with the BPC's Democracy Project, and he's served previously 36 years as Michigan's Director of Elections. So without further ado, we'll go down the line, and Mandy, I know, had some things to highlight about ERIC particularly, and list maintenance, and so please.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to be here, Matt. Thank you, and to the Bipartisan Policy Center. It's fantastic to be here and representing Ohio and Secretary of State Frank LaRose. Ohio has been a member of ERIC for a while now, and ERIC, for those of you who don't know, stands for the Electronic Registration Information Center. It's specifically recommendation 4 and 4A of the task force report. And we are very proud members of ERIC in Ohio. ERIC member states, of which there are 30 members, so 29 states and the District of Columbia. And the recommendation itself is that, you know, all states should join ERIC for secure data sharing and list maintenance. And it is a fantastic organization that is led by wonderful people. Georgia recently joined, so we're grateful to have them. Florida is another notable state that joined. ERIC, Kentucky, and Vermont as well. And Ohio uses ERIC in the secure transfer and sharing of data to do many different things. And Secretary LaRose is very passionate about maximizing Ohio's access and data sharing, and one of those ways that we plan to do so is increasing our eligible but unregistered mailing frequencies. So that's again sharing data with other states to identify the list of folks in your states that are of eligible voting age but are unregistered to vote. So sending them a postcard and saying, hey, we noticed that you're eligible to vote, but you're unregistered. Please visit voteohio.gov and register to vote online in the state of Ohio. So we're very passionate about our membership in ERIC and the partnership there, and fully are on board with the task force recommendation that all states should join ERIC. And just a few stats to share from ERIC, but the total voting eligible population of ERIC member states is 127.5 million. That is a lot of people, which is great. And 34 million voters have been identified as eligible but unregistered through ERIC member states data sharing. So it's a great way to identify folks. It's a great way to increase civic engagement and really engage with the voting population. So we're thrilled about the task force recommendation there. List maintenance can be a political thing, and that's really why, we love the BPC and the task force recommendation, because of the polarization that we're in right now. It's great to sit next to Judd. It's great to interact with secretaries of states and election directors of all different political affiliations to do what's best for the voter. And that's something that Secretary LaRose is very passionate about. You guys may have heard of a U.S. Supreme Court case that was solely about Ohio's list maintenance process that, ultimately our process was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, but Secretary LaRose settled that case in 2019. And if any of you find Frank LaRose on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and watch the video of Andre Washington, the Ohio president of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, the entity that had originally sued the previous administration, thanking Secretary LaRose for his work in list maintenance and doing the right thing, settling the case, and moving forward in a really positive bipartisan way. If it doesn't bring you to tears, it'll bring you really close to tears. So find that video. And finally, I'll just say, last year in 2019, the previous administration in 2015 had started what in Ohio is our clock of cancellations, essentially. And what Secretary LaRose did was unprecedentedly transparent, and he actually published the list of those individuals who were set to be canceled. And ultimately, what we did is he worked with the Ohio League of Women Voters, the A. Philip Randolph Institute, the NAACP, a ton of other groups to go out and find these people, get them registered, get them engaged in that process, in that democratic process again. And it actually, we hope that it serves as a nationwide leader. I know our friends in Georgia actually did the same thing with their list maintenance process this past year as well. So we're really proud of our transparent efforts to get as many people in Ohio registered as possible.
Right. Great. Well, thanks. Judd, from Colorado, your state's already been invoked. The Colorado way involves mail ballots and RLAs, and there's a number of recommendations in the reports related to that, and I know you have a few things to say.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks to the BPC for setting this up and for engaging in this year-long process to identify these recommendations. I think there's a pretty remarkable thing about the process and the recommendations that the BPC developed, and that is that there are Democrats and Republicans on this stage. There are people with a lot of experience. There are people with less experience. There are people from more rural states, more urban states, states that are sort of have that Eastern model, which is based more in polling places, the Western model, which is based more in vote at home and in that kind of strategy. And we were able to come up with 30 plus recommendations that we could all agree to. Every one of us in the room could buy into those recommendations. I think that is an amazing thing, and we should, frankly, your legislatures, the Congress should recognize that these are all things that we can all get behind. A couple of the things that really stood out to me involve vote by mail. Colorado is a state where we send every active voter a mail ballot 22 days prior to the election. We figure that that's an easier way to transmit that ballot to our voters than having them get in a car and come see us and we have to slide it across a counter. We're willing to put it in an envelope and send it to you. So the recommendation is that all states allow for a voter to sign up for a mail ballot, and that they should be able to receive that ballot prior to the election, and that should be a pretty seamless process. There are sort of sub-recommendations to that, which are that if you want to get a mail ballot and you want to sign up for multiple elections at a time, you should be able to do that, and I think that makes a lot of sense as well. Again, in Colorado, it's permanent, and because we do it for all of our active voters. The other part of that is that if you're in a state where a lot of people are getting their ballot by mail, and you have a lot of voters that are voting those mail ballots, you should provide opportunities for those voters to hand off those ballots in an easy way. And the easiest, sort of most straightforward way to do that is to have drop boxes throughout your state where you can drop off those ballots in a very local way and not have to go stand in line or go to a vote center or to a polling place. Again, Colorado, we have 400 plus drop boxes around the state. Washington, Oregon, these other states which have these long-standing vote-by-mail policies have a lot of drop boxes, and it's very successful. It leads to more voter engagement across more elections. So maybe some of the low-interest elections generate a lot more interest when you hand a ballot to them. So that's a really smart way. It's a good policy. It's one that we could all agree on. The other thing is risk-limiting audits, or audits in general, risk-limiting audits in Colorado. I think a very good policy, a policy that we could all get around at the Bipartisan Policy Center with this group, was to audit your election results. And there are various ways in which you can do that. At the very basic, though, you should be doing something to show that your voters that you have taken it upon yourself to make sure that the outcome that you have produced it matches the actual will of the voters. And the way you do that is through one of many auditing procedures. Again, in Colorado, we've developed risk-limiting audits. As Secretary Raffensperger mentioned, it is a long process. There was a big rollout. And so it's not something that realistically a state could go, yeah, I want to do risk-limiting audits, and then 6 months later they're doing them. That's not realistic. But you can do it, and if you employ the sort of strategy, the resources, and develop good laws, you can roll out risk-limiting audits or some sort of auditing procedure, which makes sense. And a sub-point to that is really you should be doing audits before you certify results, because if you certify results and then you do an audit and the audit finds that there was a problem, you've put the wrong people in office, and then you have a real substantive, perhaps pretty significant long-term problem that you're going to have to be in court about, and you might even have the wrong people in elected offices. So you really should be doing those auditing procedures before you certify outcomes, which in many states would require changes in law so that they can push out certification. So those are two really important areas in which I think the Bipartisan Policy Center and the group of people that we brought together to do those recommendations really identified very good recommendations.
Right, great. Thanks, Judd. Mm-hmm. Brian, you've been an advocate for harnessing technology in improving elections, and there's some things that you have to say.
Yeah, well, first off, I'd like to thank Matt for invoking Florida earlier. It's back to therapy for me, Matt. Thank you for that.
No one ever does it.
Yeah, exactly. Representative Davis, I think, said it best when he said earlier that election policy matters, and that is a logical leap to the Bipartisan Policy Center. And this committee, quite frankly, as my fellow committee member Judd alluded to, it was made up of a spectrum of political ideologies and geographic and different approaches. Came together and came up with common sense, bipartisan approach and recommendations. But with regards to the process and certainly harnessing technology, I think it's important that we never lose sight. There are many stakeholders in this room and of course watching, but I think we'd all agree the most important stakeholder would be the voters. And we must always keep that in mind in whatever we're discussing. And we do, and we should keep that certainly. With regards of harnessing technology, it's truly a necessity, I think. You know, if you look where we are as a society, I often tell groups that if you think about it, the smartphone is 1,000 times more powerful than what we used to put men on the moon. And yet, what do most people use it for? Snapchat or debating silly stuff on Facebook. But you can harness that technology to make for better elections administration. A few things that come to mind. Who would have thought we'd have in a good chunk of our nation online voter registration? Doesn't matter. My daughter's in the military, and I tell her that her fellow sailors can register to vote from their ship in the South China Sea. Never closed, always open for business. Be able to change your address, your political party, et cetera. Electronic poll books are another one that comes to mind. Certainly digital scanners, ballot marking devices. We've come a long way from, dare I say, hanging chads, to bring that up again. Even as Amanda mentioned with ERIC, electronic is part of ERIC. It's in the word itself. So the electronic aspect of data swaps. Even websites, it's a great resource for voters, prospective voters, to do little things like find out who their elected officials are, find out information about where early voting locations are. Information certainly is powerful with that, and it allows them to check the status of their absentee or vote by mail ballot, for example. They can even opt in for text alerts for where their ballot is located in transit for when they're voting by mail or whatnot. Social media gets a bad rap, and to some degree, rightfully so. And Clint Watts, the author, said it best when he said, "The internet has brought us together, but social media is tearing us apart, polarizing us as a nation." But with regards to election administration, it's a great tool to disseminate information to your stakeholders, and certainly, sometimes sadly, refute misinformation and disinformation, I think, and that's going to be a huge issue during 2020, certainly. So, it's a great opportunity to use that technology to reach out to voters and the stakeholders, but there's a huge caveat with that. Be remiss not to mention the 800-pound gorilla, security, both physical and cyber, of course. So when you talk about things such as electronic poll books, having a backup register in the event there's an issue or there's a power outage of some sort of anomaly, for example, having a robust cybersecurity plan to protect your online voter registration platform and certainly voter registration as well. And things such as having that continuation of operations plan. So it's wonderful to harness that technology, but you have to have a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D, I think, to make it all come together and work.
Right. Thanks, Brian.
Sure.
And then, Chris, you spent a lot of time in Michigan and in elections there, and Michigan is known for pioneering, really, kind of automating voter registration, and recommendations in the report touch on that, and I know that you can say things about that recommendation from your deep well of experience.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd really thank BPC for pulling together election officials. This is a report by election officials that is voter-centric. There was a time, if you put that many election officials together, you would have had an election official's view of the world. Election officials today are very voter-centric, which is where they need to be. And as Charles said, yes, I can get on a soapbox about motor voter for quite some time. I doubt he'll give me the whole 7 minutes, so I will just move right along. So in the 90s, the National Voter Registration Act was passed that did motor voter, and the Department of Motor Vehicles, the DMVs, and social service agencies would give opportunities to register to vote. 44 states were covered. The remaining states had election day registration, so they were exempt. The Presidential Commission on Election Administration in 2014 concluded that it was really poorly performing up to the expectations that were out there. Most states were well below 50% of the transactions coming from the DMVs, which is a place where everybody comes to for IDs, for driver's licenses, and social service necessities. So there's been a lot of work in the various states dealing with how to improve that. So when you went to a DMV before, it was an opt-in. They asked you, do you want to register? And the numbers were so low. Why was that? Well, in many cases, you never got asked. In other cases, you'd been there long enough that standing around to fill out another form just really wasn't on your agenda, so you left. So now we're seeing, and our recommendation deals with the opt-out. So in other words, you're registered unless you opt out. And that's really the big change that we're looking at. Now it's called automatic voter registration, which is a real misnomer because it's not automatic. If you don't opt out, you're in. But the election officials are not going to actually add you to the file until they've taken the various steps to accept your citizenship, residency, age, for example. So there's two types, and our preferred type is the front end, which is at the point of service, you have the opportunity to opt out. And at that same time, you can add your political party preference and whatnot if your state requires that. The other one is a back end where you go through, you are put on the list. This is communicated to the local election official who then sends you a notice and gives you an opportunity to opt out and add your political party. Well, as you know, most people don't respond to those types of notices. And so what a few states that are doing this are finding is that very few people are selecting a political party through that type of system, which is going to be an issue when they get to a partisan primary. So with this, the full spirit of the NVRA is arising here. We're seeing some incredible numbers in the Election Assistance Commission's EVES reports. So let me just give you a few that I think will underline the importance of this program. So I looked at the 2014 series, which is 2 years, 13 and 14, and the 2018, which is 17 and 18. And in there, 5 states who had adopted an opt-out doubled the number of transactions coming from their DMVs. Oregon, Vermont, Maryland, Alaska, and Georgia, 4 times the number of transactions coming through the DMVs. Just an incredible amount of data, which really lives up to what the NVRA was intended to do. And I'll give a shout out to Georgia. They had 850,000 transactions in 2014 cycle. In the 2018 cycle, 3.5 million. That will give you an idea of how many people are being placed on the rolls in all of these states that have adopted the opt-out system. And what this does, it doesn't only just put people on, it keeps them on. So as they move, which 25% of the people do every year, they are retained on the file. And so that takes care of a major list maintenance issue, is that you move from one place, they transfer you right over. So you're not going through notices and whatnot. So on the whole, I would say probably the most incredible thing here is the amount of people that are added to the files who will be in position to vote if they choose to.
Thanks a lot, Chris. So I think y'all get a sense about the quality of the recommendations in the report. We have time for questions, and so get ready to ask them. We'll do the same as before. I would like you to raise your hands. We have a couple of people with microphones to bring them to you. Please identify yourself. That was a good thing that happened the previous session. And ask a question, ask a real question. So yes, ma'am, right on the front.
I'm Kay O'Shull, a retired Department of Labor employee. About the Colorado system, I had 2 quick questions. Am I correct that it's the only mail balloting is the only way to vote? Oh, okay. You explain it. And then the drop boxes, where are they? What's the security?
Yeah, good question. So Colorado, we like to say, is the Burger King model, do it your way. It's kind of a buffet of options. We mail a ballot 22 days prior to the election. Then we open vote centers 15 days prior to the election. So there's vote centers in every county, and vote centers are based on population. There's a formula, and then there's a set of days. So as you approach the election, counties have to employ more and more vote centers. And then on election day, the formula requires one for every 10,000 people. So even though we're handing you a ballot ahead of time, we're still providing you the back end opportunities. The second question was?
The drop box.
Drop boxes, yes, drop boxes. So also under state law, you have to have a certain number of drop boxes based on population, and then we require drop boxes on college campuses. So if you have a college campus of 2,000 or more students, you have to have a drop box. And then on Indian reservations. So we have 2 Indian reservations in Colorado. They're required to have drop boxes as well. So the drop box formula, you might anticipate, Denver County, 40 plus drop boxes, El Paso County, Arapahoe County, Jeffco, Adams County, all of our larger counties have 20, 30, 40 drop boxes. And then you'll have very small counties with less population, which might have 1 or 2.
Where are they and how
They're
secure?
typically, security. So typically they are on government facilities or government land. They tend to be outside of libraries or rec centers or sheriff's offices or postal offices. And under state law, they are required to be under 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365-day a year security. And then those security images, so the 45 days prior to an election becomes an election record. And again, under our state law, you have to hold that for 25 months. So that does, on occasion, become something that ends up in a court case after an election, where they want to pull that record and make sure that nothing did happen or something did happen at a particular drop box during an election.
So let's move on. The fellow in the yellow shirt in the back, and then I'll get you.
Jason Dunlap with SELPS. A couple of follow-up questions for Colorado. Is Colorado a postmark state or an in-hand state? Do you allow ballot harvesting like California? And how does it work for a primary?
Okay, let me see if I can get these. We are an in-hand state, and the thinking there is that we don't want to have a gap in time in which we're not pretty confident about who won these elections. We want to be able to identify our winners pretty much right away.
So define terms here, Professor.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. In hand means that we have, some election official in the state has to have those ballots by 7 p.m. on election day, as opposed to a postmark, which might extend the window of time in which that ballot could come in for 3 days or 5 days or into the following week. So that's one thing. Now, I'm not going to remember your other questions.
Ballot harvesting?
So ballot harvesting in Colorado, we allow somebody to bring in as many as 5 ballots. So for me, that's bringing in my wife's ballot. We have an 18-year-old, I might bring in her ballot. So that's the way that works. We had a longer or a bigger group of ballots that you could bring in, but we changed that in state law. And then the last question. So we have a pseudo-open primary. The way that our primary works is that if you're unaffiliated, we're going to send you both ballots. We're going to send you a Democratic ballot and a Republican ballot in the same mailing. You get to choose which one you vote. If you return them both, that's fine, it's just as long as one is voted. If they're both voted, then we have to spoil both of them. You're not going to get that vote counted. The thinking there being we want our unaffiliated voters to have some say in who will be the general election candidates. If you are affiliated, you have to change your affiliation 29 days or more prior to the election to be able to vote in the other race, so the other side. If you're a Democrat, you have to change prior to the election to vote as a Republican and vice versa. But as an unaffiliated, you can come in on election day. We'll give you whichever ballot you want.
Thanks. Right here. And, Yeah.
Well, it follows up a little bit, but I'm happy to have others comment on it as well. My name is Rick LaRue. I serve on the Advisory Council of the Election Reformers Network. It is about mail balloting and postmark balloting. We all recall Arizona and California having some late results that were days after election night. What is the thinking about how that changes, what needs to be done so that those problems are minimized, and so how and any others can comment, of course, on that as well.
And I'm sure Judd will talk, but all the states here actually have issues related to this, so the others can jump in
So
too.
I'll throw out mine. We're really concerned about that because it's a legitimacy question. We want to make sure that the people, our populace, and frankly all around the country and around the world, understand that the person that's been elected for a given office has been legitimately elected. And I'm going to go off script a little bit and say, we're very concerned about elected officials around the country and prominent national officials who sort of discount the legitimacy of elections because it takes a while to do that process. And it does, I mean, elections don't happen on a day. They happen over the course of time. And there's a gap in time between election day and when you can actually certify an election. So it's important for people to understand that. But we like to tighten that as much as we can, and that means not allowing for postmarks, but in hand.
Brian, Florida essentially runs 3 elections, and one of those elections is a mail election. Yeah. So what's your experience in terms of the special considerations with mail elections in kind of a more of a traditional state?
Yeah, so ours must be in hand by 7 p.m. on election day. The biggest issue we see is educating voters. There's a little more of a delay than had been in the past with the USPS as far as the mailing of the ballots, and so we try and educate our voters. But in doing analysis, we find a vast majority of those that arrive after 7 p.m. on election day, oftentimes were put in the mail the day before or the day of the election day. It's just something not going to get back by. You can't put it in your mailbox at noon on election day, expect it to magically get back by 7 p.m. Not philosophically opposed to postmark, personally, but it would take a change in our state constitution and a myriad of state laws. We have a very short timeline in Florida to certify our elections, and that would be a huge issue. So, voters get their ballots now 40 days in advance. So there's plenty of time to mail it. They can drop it off to one of our secure drop boxes at early voting or at our offices. So we really don't. Contrary to what you may read about, it's really not that much of an issue, quite frankly. Voters are getting it and getting it back, those who decide to vote ballots, of course. So.
And Mandy?
Yeah, so we're both in hand and postmarked, and so we haven't, of the many issues that that exist in elections, that is not one of them in Ohio.
We found one. That's good. And there's a question over here. I'll go to this side next if somebody has a question, but over here.
So,
yes.
Obviously, there's a concern after 2016, some of what we saw with attempts at hacking election systems. A couple of folks were talking about audits up there. Can you talk a little bit about how that could alleviate those concerns and whether you're worried about states and localities that don't have audits set up for 2020, what that might mean?
Who wants to jump in first? Do you just want to go down the line?
Sure, absolutely. So we actually, Secretary LaRose helped introduce and our General Assembly just passed and the governor signed into law, Senate Bill 52, that increases the frequency of audits that need to be done in Ohio. So we're really proud of that. Liz Howard, I see her in the background there. Also in that bill is the opportunity to perform a risk limiting audit. So we're also increasing the types of audits, the variety that can be done at the local level, which is fantastic. Liz and her team actually did several pilots in Ohio for risk limiting audits, but we are very pro audit. I think it absolutely, we actually came up with, for our local counties, a template press release for them to engage with folks like you to, again, legitimize the results of the election and say, hey, media, we did an audit. It was great. It was 100%, and please publish that. And we've had a really good relationship with our media and interacting that to publicize the results. Because it's one thing to say that you did it. It's another to show the work, if that makes sense. So in Ohio, we're really proud of that, and it's gotten great results.
Yeah, audits are absolutely essential. You must do an audit. If your state isn't doing an audit, there's still an opportunity for you to do one. You either got to pass a law and you got to do a lot of work right away, or there's a great alternative, which is what Maryland does. After an election is complete, you can take all your ballots and you can rerun them with a different system and and actually look at the images. So you get like a picture image of each ballot and put that stuff online. Let people look to see, hey, do I believe in the outcome of this election? I can look and I can do my own count if I want to. So auditing an election is essential for voter confidence, and I absolutely think that every state should do it.
And I just, go ahead.
I was saying audits are absolutely a necessity, and nothing says fun like Florida and recounts. In 2018, if you ever want to have an audit on steroids, do 3 statewide recounts, because you're feeding them through different tabulators, high-speed tabulators, and the results better be the same, obviously. But then you're looking at every overvote and undervote in the entire state. It doesn't get much more of an audit than that, and obviously it solidified the results. And you're doing testing those machines as well. But yeah, I agree. It's a necessity in this day and age.
Yeah, and Michigan has jumped into the risk limiting audit, and our challenge is that we're a home rule state. So we have 1,500 cities and townships run the elections, and we don't have the benefit of mail ballots that Judd has, where at the end of the night they're all nicely stacked, and then when you come in to do the risk limiting audit and you're doing random samplings, it's real easy to find. When they're distributed out in various tabulator bins, that's a lot more difficult, but we've worked with folks, and that's coming along. And as important are performance audits, and those really need to be done over a whole myriad of very detailed requirements to make sure that election officials are really dotting the I's and crossing the T's.
And I should add, in the report, we spent they spend a lot of time on issues of auditing, and one of the things that the report tried to do is think not only about your recommendations themselves, but the knock-on effects of recommendations. And so you'll find in the report not only a recommendation that states do more sophisticated statistical audits, but also think about the certification periods and think about and think about when the auditing is done, before certification rather than afterwards. So it's not just that you flip a switch and you do auditing. You really have to think comprehensively about how you run elections, all the way from casting the ballots ultimately to certifying to make it work, and that's not usually going to happen overnight. I think we have time for one more question. Going, and if not, I think Matt is going to. Oh, we do have one. Sorry, Matt.
Hi, Tim Harper at Bipartisan Policy Center. One thing that I think is important to discuss is that there's important upstream and downstream effects from making modifications to elections, whether that means the time frame for which things happen or the effects that they have unintended. So can you talk a little bit about the ways in which the reforms in this package are structured, and if there is a reform earlier in the process, what does that mean for when certification happens? If an audit occurs before certification, are there other parts of the report, speaking from experience I can say there are, that account for that?
So one thing I would say is that you have to think holistically about what you're trying to employ. So if you walk away from reading the recommendations thinking, hey, great, we should really employ an earlier voter registration deadline, and we should try to go with mail ballots. Well, okay. So if you have an earlier voter registration deadline, Colorado has same-day registration, and you have mail ballots, how is that going to work? If somebody registers to vote the day before the election or on election day, I can't really mail them a ballot at that point. Those two things are incongruent. So I have to come up with a way to make that policy work. So you have to be strategic in the way that you think about that. By the way that we do that is we cut off at 8 days whether we're going to send you a ballot. If you register inside of 8 days, great. Come on in, we'll give you a ballot. You go to a vote center or come by a polling place, no problem, we're going to get a ballot. The problem, though, is we can't mail you one at that point, because we know that that's not going to get to you, and even if it does get to you, it can't get turned around and get back to us. So you have to think about it holistically and try to piece it together so that it makes sense.
Yeah, I would just add that the election calendar for each state is obviously so unique, and it's a snowball effect. You change one thing, it changes everything else. And so I would just encourage, public policymakers, lawmakers, election officials, holistic is the exact word. I mean, you really have to think about unintended consequences when you are changing something. And it's not that change shouldn't occur, it absolutely should, but really thinking hard and deep about what the impact of that change is going to be. And I think that, it sounds like Congressman Davis really and his team are working hard to think about those things holistically. And we encourage state lawmakers to do the same.
Great. And that's a good note to end on. And I was going to remark as well, Congressman Davis talked about the need for cooperation. And as somebody kind of lurked on the edges observing this process, I was very impressed with the cooperation, as you can see on the stage, among the election directors who came in with a variety of perspectives and nonetheless could distill out some practices that everyone should consider and consider adopting. So I'd like to thank the panelists and who did a great job, and turn it back over to Matt.
Thank you, Charles, for moderating this panel. Thank you for panel 2. Thank you for panel 1, and for Congressman for coming. And thank you for all coming. So that's the end of our session.